I didn't know that asking for one simple thing would make one of the most powerful men in the city forget how to breathe. The night had happened. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets outside slick and shining under the neon glow of the bar sign. And everything smelled like wet asphalt and expensive perfume drifting in every time the door opened. And I remember thinking how quiet it felt for a Friday, the kind of quiet that never lasts in a place like this, the kind that makes you check the clock twice just to be sure the world hasn't paused without telling you. I was halfway through wiping down the counter, my fingers moving on autopilot after an 8-hour shift, when the door opened again, slower this time, heavier somehow, and the air changed before I even looked up, like the room had decided to hold its breath. You learn to read people in this job, not by what they say but by what everyone else does when they walk in, and nobody said anything. Nobody had to, because the conversations dimmed, the laughter softened, and even the guy at the far end who'd been arguing about baseball suddenly found something interesting in his drink. That's when I looked up and saw him. He didn't rush, didn't scan the room like he needed approval. He just walked in like the space already belonged to him, like the floor would adjust itself if it had to. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but when you spend enough nights behind a bar, you notice the difference between confidence and something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, something that doesn't need to prove anything. He took a seat right in front of me, not asking if it was available, just settling in like it had been waiting for him. And for a second, I thought about all the stories people tell about men like that, the ones who move through the city without leaving footprints, the ones who don't raise their voices because they never need to. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low, steady, like he wasn't used to repeating himself, and I nodded, reaching for a glass, doing exactly what I'd done 1,000 times before, except this time my hand paused just slightly when I set it down in front of him, because something about the way he looked at me felt different, not threatening, not exactly, just focused, like he was trying to figure something out that no one had ever shown him before. Maybe that's why I didn't hesitate, why I didn't second-guess myself, why I just followed the rule that had gotten me through every shift without trouble, the same rule I'd repeated so many times it felt like muscle memory, and I said it the same way I always did, calm, direct, like it wasn't negotiable. "I need to see your ID." The words hung there for half a second longer than they should have, like the room needed time to understand what I'd just said, and then everything around us shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a ripple moving through still water, and I caught the bartender at the other end staring at me like I'd just stepped into traffic without looking. But I didn't look away, didn't smile it off or take it back, because rules are rules, and I'd learned a long time ago that the second you bend them for someone, you lose more than you think. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, really looked at me, like he was seeing something that didn't quite fit into the world he was used to. And for a second, I wondered if I'd made a mistake, not because I was scared, but because something in his expression felt unfamiliar, like I'd just interrupted a story he'd been telling himself for years. And then, slowly, almost thoughtfully, the corner of his mouth lifted, not into a smile exactly, but into something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of a question neither of us knew how to ask yet. And in that moment, I realized something I couldn't explain at the time, something I wouldn't fully understand until much later, that whatever I had just done, whatever line I had just crossed without even knowing it existed, there was no going back to before it, because I hadn't just asked for his ID, I had just treated him like he was human, and somehow, that was the one thing he wasn't prepared for. He did not reach for his wallet right away, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, not dangerous, not aggressive, just delayed, like time had slipped a fraction of a second out of place, and I noticed it because people like him usually move without hesitation, like every decision has already been made before the moment arrives. But he stayed still, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the bar, his eyes still on mine, as if the request itself had caught him off guard in a way he could not quite explain. Around us, the room had not gone back to normal, not really, because even though the music continued and glasses clinked in the background, there was a tension underneath it now, a quiet awareness that something unusual was happening, and I could feel it in the way the bartender at the far end kept glancing over, in the way a couple near the door lowered their voices, like they were watching a scene unfold that was not meant for them. I did not break eye contact, not because I was trying to challenge him, but because that was the job, that was the rule, and rules only work if you treat everyone the same. even when something inside you whispers that this person might not belong to the same category as everyone else. I just need to verify your age, I added, my voice steady, neutral, the same tone I used for college kids with fake confidence and expensive watches, the same tone I used for regulars who thought familiarity meant exceptions. And for a second, I wondered if he would laugh, or ignore me, or simply stand up and leave like men sometimes do when they are not used to being told no. Instead, he exhaled slowly, almost like he had been holding that breath longer than he realized. And then he reached into his jacket with a kind of deliberate calm that made the movement feel important, like it meant more than it should have. And when he placed the ID on the bar, he did not slide it toward me right away. He just set it there between us, his hand still resting on top of it, like he was giving himself one last second to consider something I could not see. I waited, because that is what you do when someone hesitates. You give them space to finish the moment on their own terms. And finally, he lifted his hand and pushed the card forward, just enough for me to pick it up. It was heavier than I expected, not physically, but in the way it felt in my hand, like it carried more weight than a simple piece of identification should. And I glanced down at it, scanning the name, the date, the details that mattered, even though I could feel his eyes still on me, steady, focused, like he was watching not what I did, but how I did it. Adrian Volkov. The name meant nothing to me at that moment. Just letters on a card, just another customer passing through another shift, and I nodded once, placing the ID back on the counter and sliding the glass of whiskey toward him with the same efficiency I used for everyone else. You are good, I said, simple, final, already reaching for the next order ticket, already moving on, because that is how nights like this go, one interaction blending into the next until nothing stands out unless you let it. But he did not reach for the drink immediately. And that was the second thing that felt different, the way he stayed there, looking at me like he was trying to understand something that had never needed understanding before, like I had just handed him a version of himself he had never been forced to see. You check everyone like that? He asked after a moment, his voice quieter now, less like a command and more like a question he was not used to asking, and I shrugged slightly, wiping down the counter again, keeping my movements steady even though I could feel the weight of his attention following every small motion. Everyone, I said, because that was the truth, because anything else would have broken the rule, and something about that answer seemed to settle into him in a way I could not explain, like it confirmed something he had not known he was looking for. He finally picked up the glass, but instead of drinking, he just held it for a second, his gaze drifting away and then back again, like he was trying to return to whatever version of himself had walked in here a few minutes ago, and finding that it did not quite fit anymore. And I did not realize it then, not fully, but that was the moment the shift began, not in the room, not in the way people reacted to him, but inside him, quiet and irreversible like a crack forming in something that had always seemed unbreakable. He did not finish the whiskey that night, and that was the third thing that stayed with me. Not because it was unusual for someone to leave a drink behind, but because everything about him suggested precision, intention, the kind of person who did not start something without finishing it. And yet when he stood up, placing a bill on the counter without checking the total, he looked at the glass for a second like it no longer mattered, like something else had replaced the reason he had ordered it. In the first place. Have a good night, I said automatically, already turning to the next customer, already moving forward the way shifts demand. But I felt it, the pause, the fraction of a second where he did not move right away, like he was considering saying something more, something that did not quite exist yet, and then he left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. The room exhaled after that, conversations picking back up, laughter returning in uneven waves, but the energy did not fully reset, not for me. Because I found myself replaying the interaction in small flashes while I worked, the way his hand had lingered on the ID, the way he had looked at me like I had done something unexpected without trying to, and I shook it off more than once, reminding myself that people are just people, that no one is as complicated as they seem when you are standing behind a bar long enough. By the time my shift ended, the streets had dried, the neon lights reflecting cleanly off the pavement instead of bleeding into it. And the air had cooled just enough to make the walk home feel sharper, clearer, like the city had reset itself while I was inside. I did not think about him again until the next night. Not really. not in any meaningful way, because there are always faces, always voices, always small moments that blur together until they disappear entirely, and I expected this to be one of them, just another interaction filed away without importance. But then the door opened again, same slow wait, same shift in the air, and I felt it before I saw him, that quiet change in the room that did not announce itself but made everything else adjust around it. And when I looked up, he was there, taking the same seat like nothing had changed and everything had. This time, I did not pause, did not hesitate. I just reached for a glass and set it down in front of him, the rhythm of the job carrying me forward, steady and familiar. And he watched me the same way he had the night before, not impatient, not demanding, just present, like he had chosen to be here for a reason he had not fully explained to himself yet. "Whiskey," he said again, and there was something almost ironic about the repetition, like we were both stepping back into a moment that had not quite ended. I poured the drink, set it down, and held out my hand without thinking twice. "ID," I said, the words simple, unchanged, exactly the same as before, and this time, there was no hesitation, no pause, just a quiet exhale and the immediate movement of his hand reaching into his jacket, placing the card in my palm before I could even lower my gaze, like he had already decided something between last night and now, something that made this exchange different, easier. And when I glanced down at the name again, Adrian Volkov, it felt less like a stranger and more like a detail I was beginning to recognize. "You came back," I said without meaning to, the words slipping out softer than I expected, and he tilted his head slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could define. "You asked me for something no one else does," he said, his voice lower, almost thoughtful, like he was still working through the meaning of it as he spoke, and I let out a small breath, half amused, half confused, because to me, it had been nothing, just a rule, just part of the job, and yet the way he said it made it sound like something else entirely, something that had followed him out of the bar and into whatever world he returned to when he walked out that door. I handed the ID back, nodding once, and this time, when he picked up the glass, he actually took a sip, slow and measured, but his eyes did not leave me, not even for a second, and I realized then, in a way that settled somewhere deeper than logic, that whatever had shifted the night before had not reset with the morning. It had carried over, grown quieter, stronger, and I had the strange, unshakable feeling that I was no longer just serving a customer. I was part of something unfolding in real time, something I did not understand yet, but had already stepped into without knowing there was a choice. By the third night, I stopped telling myself it was a coincidence, because people do not repeat patterns like that without a reason, and even though nothing about him was loud or obvious, his presence had started to feel like a fixed point in the room, something everything else adjusted around without question. He walked in at almost the exact same time, not early, not late, just precise enough to make it noticeable if you were paying attention, and I realized I had been paying attention before I even admitted it to myself, because the moment the door opened, my hand slowed just slightly, my focus shifting without permission. He took the same seat again, and this time, no one pretended not to notice. Because recognition changes things, it gives shape to what used to feel like coincidence, and I caught the bartender at the far end watching him with a kind of careful neutrality, like he knew something I did not and had decided not to share it. "Whiskey," he said again, but there was a faint shift in his tone now, less like a request, more like a ritual, like the word itself had become part of whatever this was between us, and I poured it without a second thought, setting the glass down in front of him before extending my hand in the same steady motion. "ID." This time, there was no pause at all, no hesitation, just the immediate response of someone who had already accepted the rule, who had already chosen to follow it. And he placed the card into my hand with a calm that felt intentional, like he was giving me exactly what I had asked for without resistance, without question. I glanced down, more out of habit than necessity now, the name already familiar, the details already known, and handed it back with a small nod. "You always follow the rules this closely?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice, something almost curious, like he was trying to understand the structure behind something that had always seemed simple to me. I shrugged slightly, wiping down the counter again, grounding myself in the rhythm of the job. "It makes things easier," I said, because it was true, because rules are not about control, They are about clarity, about knowing where things stand so you do not have to guess. He watched me for a moment, longer than necessary, and then took a slow sip of his drink, but his attention did not drift, it stayed fixed, like I had become part of the environment he was trying to map out in his head. Most people change the rules depending on who they are dealing with, he said after a second, and I let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a disagreement. That is usually when things start going wrong, I replied, and something in that answer seemed to settle into him again, deeper this time, like it connected to something he had experienced long before he ever walked into this place. The music shifted behind us, a softer track replacing the previous one, and for a moment, the world felt almost normal again, almost ordinary, except for the way the space between us carried a different kind of weight now, not tense, not uncomfortable, just aware, like both of us knew something had changed but neither of us had decided to name it yet. A group of customers at the far end called for another round, pulling my attention away for a few seconds, and when I turned back, he was still there, still watching, but not in a way that felt invasive, more like he was studying something he did not want to misunderstand. Why do you keep coming back? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quieter than I intended, more personal than anything I had said before, and for the first time since he walked in, he looked away, just briefly, like he needed a second to find the right answer or decide if he was going to give one at all. When his eyes returned to mine, there was something new in them, something less guarded, less distant. Because you treat me like I am not who I am supposed to be, he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, not because I understood them immediately, but because I could feel that they mattered to him in a way I had not expected, and I realized then, standing there with a towel in my hand and the hum of the bar around us, that whatever role I thought I was playing in this interaction, it was no longer as simple as serving drinks and checking IDs, because somehow, without meaning to, I had become the one place in his world where the rules were different. And that was not something that could stay small for long. The fifth night felt different before it even began, not because anything obvious had changed, but because I caught myself expecting him. And that was new. That quiet shift from noticing to anticipating, from reacting to waiting, and I did not like how easily it slipped into place, how naturally it settled into the rhythm of my shift like it had always been there. I told myself it was nothing, just pattern recognition, just routine, the way you start to recognize regulars after enough nights, but this did not feel the same, because regulars come for comfort, for habit, for familiarity, and there was nothing comfortable about the way the room adjusted when he walked in, nothing casual about the way conversations softened and eyes shifted without anyone meaning to. When the door finally opened, I did not look up right away, not because I did not know it was him, but because I did, because something in me had already registered it before my eyes confirmed it, and I forced myself to finish pouring a drink, to complete the motion, to stay grounded in the routine that kept everything simple. He took his seat like always, steady, unhurried, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us not awkward, not heavy, just present, like it had its own place in the exchange now. You are early, I said, glancing at the clock above the shelves, noticing the difference even if it was only by a few minutes. And he followed my gaze briefly before looking back at me, something unreadable passing through his expression. I wanted to see if you would notice, he replied, and the honesty in that answer caught me off guard more than anything else he had said so far, because it was simple, direct, and somehow more revealing than any explanation would have been. I set the glass in front of him without thinking, the movement automatic now, and held out my hand again. ID, I said, because that part had not changed, because that part could not change, and he handed it over immediately. No hesitation, no delay, just the quiet acceptance of a rule he had chosen to follow, and I wondered, not for the first time, what that meant to him, what it represented in a world where I was starting to realize rules probably worked very differently. You could stop asking, he said as I handed it back, his tone neutral, not challenging, not pushing, just stating a possibility, and I shook my head slightly, already turning to grab a bottle for another customer. I could, I said, but then it would not mean anything anymore. He was quiet after that, and I could feel him thinking, not in the distant way people do when they drift off, but in a focused, deliberate way, like he was turning the idea over, examining it from angles I could not see. The night moved around us in waves, orders coming in, glasses filling and emptying, conversations rising and falling, but every time I looked up, his attention was still there, steady, constant, like he had anchored himself to something in this place that he did not want to lose. A man a few seats down raised his voice over a minor disagreement. Nothing serious, just the kind of moment that happens when people have had one drink too many, but I saw it. The way Adrian's posture shifted slightly, not aggressive, not tense, just alert, like a switch had been flipped somewhere beneath the surface, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of something else, something quieter but sharper, something that reminded me that whatever world he came from did not operate on the same rules as mine. It passed just as quickly, his focus returning to me as if nothing had happened, as if that moment had not existed at all, and I realized then that there were layers to him I was only beginning to see, pieces of a larger picture that I had not asked for, but had somehow started to uncover. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise without raising in volume, and I paused, a towel in my hand, considering the question longer than I expected to. "Of what?" I asked, even though I had a feeling I already knew what he meant. "Holding the line," he said, his eyes steady on mine, "when it would be easier not to." I let out a slow breath, the answer forming before I could stop it, because it was something I had believed for longer than I could remember. "Easy does not last," I said quietly, "but what you stand for does." He did not respond right away, and for the first time since he started coming here, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like recognition, like something in my words had connected to a part of him that had been waiting, and in that moment, I understood something I had not been ready to admit before, that this was no longer just curiosity on his side or routine on mine. This was something deeper, something that was beginning to take shape between us in ways neither of us had planned, and I had the sudden, unmistakable feeling that whatever this was, it was not going to stay contained within the walls of this bar for much longer. It did not stay inside the bar. That was the first thing I understood the moment I stepped out into the night air after my shift. The city quieter now, but never truly silent. The distant hum of traffic blending into the rhythm of footsteps and flickering streetlights. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt it follow me. Not him exactly, not a presence I could point to, but a shift, like something had extended beyond the walls I thought contained it. I pulled my jacket tighter as I walked, the cool air brushing against my skin, grounding me in something familiar, something normal, and I told myself again that I was overthinking, that this was just another customer, another interaction that had grown slightly more personal than usual, but nothing more. Still, when I reached my apartment building, I paused for half a second before unlocking the door, not out of fear, but awareness, like I had started to notice details I used to ignore, the way the streetlight across the road flickered every few seconds, the way a parked car sat with its engine off but felt occupied somehow, and I shook it off as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. The next evening, the bar felt the same and different all at once. The same music, the same lighting, the same routine unfolding in familiar patterns, but I was not quite standing in it the same way anymore, because now I was aware of something beneath it, something subtle but present, like a current running under still water. He came later than usual this time, not early, not on time, but delayed just enough to make me notice the absence before the presence, and when the door finally opened, the shift was sharper, more defined, like the room had been waiting without realizing it. He took his seat without a word, but there was something different in his expression, something quieter, more focused, like whatever had been unfolding inside him over the past few nights had reached a point where it could not stay unspoken much longer. I set the glass down in front of him, the movement automatic, and extended my hand again. "ID," I said, because that was still the rule, still the anchor, and he handed it over without hesitation, but this time, his fingers brushed mine for just a fraction of a second, not intentionally, not in a way that crossed any line, just a moment of contact that felt more significant than it should have, like it carried weight neither of us acknowledged out loud. "You are thinking about something," I said before I could stop myself, the observation slipping out quietly as I handed the card back, and he let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly before returning to mine. "I am trying to understand something," he replied. And there was no distance in his voice now, no barrier, just honesty, direct and unguarded in a way that did not match the rest of him. I leaned slightly against the counter, not stepping closer, not stepping back, just staying where I was, balanced between curiosity and caution. And I asked, keeping my tone neutral, even though I could feel the weight of the moment settling in around us. He looked at me for a long second, like he was measuring the space between what he knew and what he was about to say, and then he spoke, quieter than before, but clearer. "Why it matters," he said, and I frowned slightly, not because I did not understand the words, but because I was not sure I understood the question behind them. "What matters?" I asked, and this time, he did not hesitate at all. "You," he said, simple, direct, like it was the most obvious answer in the world, and for the first time since he walked into my life, I did not have an immediate response, because something in the way he said it made it impossible to treat like a passing comment, like something casual that could be dismissed or deflected. The noise of the bar continued around us, orders being called, glasses clinking, music playing, but it all felt distant for a second, like we were standing in a separate space carved out of the same room. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started with a simple request and a rule I refused to bend, it had grown into something neither of us could ignore anymore, something that had moved beyond curiosity and into something else entirely, something that was beginning to matter in ways I had not agreed to and did not yet understand. And the most unsettling part was not that he felt it, but that a small, quiet part of me was starting to feel it too. For a moment, I forgot how to move, not in a dramatic way, not frozen or overwhelmed, just paused, like my mind needed a second longer than usual to catch up with what he had just said, because it did not fit into the space I had placed him in. It did not align with the version of this interaction I had been holding on to keep things simple. People say things all the time in places like this, casual words, empty compliments, lines meant to fill silence or create something that feels like connection without actually meaning it. But this did not feel like that, and I knew it the second he said it, because he did not look away, did not soften it with a smile, or take it back with a shrug. He just let it sit there between us like something real. I set the towel down slowly, more aware of my own movements than I had been all night, and met his gaze without stepping back, without stepping forward, just holding the space the way I always did, even though something about this moment felt different from anything that had come before it. "You do not even know me," I said, my voice steady, quieter than usual but not uncertain, because that part still mattered, the clarity, the line that separated what was real from what only felt like it in the moment. He did not argue, did not dismiss it, just tilted his head slightly, considering the words like they were part of a larger equation he was still solving. "I know enough," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no assumption, just a quiet certainty that felt more unsettling than confidence ever could, because it meant he was not guessing, he was observing, building something piece by piece in a way that did not need permission. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm of the bar, reaching for a bottle, pouring a drink for someone a few seats down, letting the motion pull me back into something steady, something I could control, but I could still feel him there, still feel the weight of his attention, not demanding, not pressing, just present in a way that did not leave room for easy distraction. "This is just a job," I said after a moment, not looking directly at him this time, letting the words land in the space between us without the intensity of eye contact, because sometimes that makes things clearer, less complicated. People come in, they leave, that is all it is. There was a brief silence after that, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like he was choosing how to respond instead of reacting, and when I finally glanced back at him, his expression had shifted slightly, not closed off, not distant, but focused in a different way, like he had moved from observing to deciding. "That might be all it is for everyone else," he said quietly, "but it is not all it is for me." The simplicity of that answer made it harder to dismiss than anything else he had said, because it did not try to convince me. It did not push. It just stated a truth from his perspective and left it there, and I felt something tighten slightly in my chest, not fear, not discomfort, just awareness, like I had reached the edge of something I had not intended to approach. A glass slipped slightly in my hand as I rinsed it, the sound of it tapping against the sink sharper than it should have been, and I steadied it quickly, annoyed at myself for letting something this small affect me, for letting a conversation shift the rhythm I relied on to stay grounded. Then that is something you need to figure out, I said, my voice firmer now, not cold, but clear, because that was the only way I knew how to handle something that did not have an easy place in my world. He watched me for a second longer, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like acceptance, not of the situation, but of the fact that I was not going to meet him halfway in the way he might have expected, and instead of pushing against it, instead of trying to change it, he simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he had just confirmed something important. I am, he said, and there was something final in the way he spoke, not an ending, but a shift, like he had moved from questioning to action in a way that I could not yet see. He picked up his glass then, taking a measured sip, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. The noise of the bar filling in the space, the movement, the rhythm, the routine reasserting itself, but beneath it, something had changed, something subtle but undeniable, and I realized with a clarity that settled deeper than I wanted it to, that whatever line I had drawn to keep this simple, to keep it contained, he had already decided it was not enough, and I had the quiet, unshakable feeling that the next move in this was not going to be mine. The next night, he did not come alone, and I knew it the second the door opened, not because he walked in differently, not because he looked any less controlled, but because the space around him felt heavier, more defined, like whatever followed him had stepped closer to the surface instead of staying just out of sight. Two men entered a few steps behind him, not speaking, not drawing attention, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Their eyes scanning the room with quiet precision before settling into positions that looked casual to anyone not paying attention and deliberate to anyone who was. I felt it ripple through the bar, subtle but unmistakable. The way conversations dipped just slightly. The way people adjusted without knowing why. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that whatever world he came from was not just something he carried inside him. It extended outward, shaping the environment around him whether he wanted it to or not. He took his usual seat, but this time, there was a difference in the way he looked at me. Not softer, not harder, just more certain, like something had already been decided before he walked in. I set the glass in front of him, my movements steady, controlled, refusing to let the shift around us affect the part of me that had remained unchanged since the first night. I said, holding out my hand the same way I always did, the word grounding me in something simple, something clear, and for a brief second, one of the men behind him shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like the request had disrupted something they were not used to seeing. Adrian did not react to them, did not even glance back. He just reached into his jacket and placed the card in my hand without hesitation, like this was the one part of his world that remained untouched by everything else. I glanced down, confirmed what I already knew, and handed it back, the exchange smooth, uninterrupted, exactly as it had been every night before. You bring company now, I asked lightly, not challenging, not probing, just acknowledging what was already there, and he followed my gaze briefly before returning his attention to me. They insist, he said, his tone neutral, almost dismissive, like their presence mattered less than the conversation unfolding between us, and I nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing further, because I had learned enough by now to understand that not every question needed to be asked out loud. The night continued, but the dynamic had shifted, not between us, but around us, the space holding a different kind of awareness now, like the edges of something were becoming clearer. A man a few seats down laughed too loudly at a joke that was not that funny, his voice cutting through the atmosphere in a way that felt slightly off, and I noticed the way one of the men behind Adrian adjusted his stance again, subtle but precise, like he was recalibrating to a change in the environment, and I felt a quiet realization settle into place, that this was not just about presence, this was about control, about maintaining a certain order that extended beyond simple observation. Adrian remained still, his focus on me unwavering, like everything else in the room existed at a distance he did not need to engage with. Does it bother you? He asked after a moment, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between us, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the question more carefully than I might have a few nights ago. No, I said honestly, because it did not in the way he might have expected, not in fear or discomfort, but in something else entirely, something closer to understanding. It just tells me more about you. He studied me for a second, something shifting behind his eyes, something quieter but deeper, like he was recognizing that I was not reacting the way most people would, not stepping back, not leaning in, just observing, just holding my ground in a way that did not challenge him, but did not yield either. "And what does it tell you?" he asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation, the answer forming with a clarity that surprised even me. "That your world does not let you be alone," I said, my voice steady, calm, and for the first time since he walked into my life, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like stillness, like the truth of that statement had landed somewhere he could not ignore, and in that moment, I realized that whatever control he carried into every room, whatever power shaped the space around him, it did not reach this part, this space between us where the rules were different, where I was not reacting to who he was supposed to be, but to who he actually was, and I had the quiet, undeniable sense that this was exactly why he kept coming back. The realization did not leave when my shift ended. It followed me into the quiet moments, into the walk home, into the way I started noticing things I used to ignore, not because anything had become dangerous, but because something had become clearer, like a pattern I had not been looking for had finally revealed itself and could not be unseen. By the time the next night came, I was not just aware of him. I was aware of everything around him, the way the room adjusted, the way people reacted without understanding why, and for the first time, I wondered what it looked like from the outside, what it meant to be the center of something like that without ever asking for it to stop. He arrived at the same time again, precise, controlled, the two men with him maintaining their quiet distance. But I noticed something new, something small but different. They stayed farther back this time, not as close, not as immediate, like a boundary had shifted just slightly without being spoken out loud. He took his seat, and for a second, neither of us moved, the silence between us no longer uncertain, no longer searching, just understood, like we had both accepted that whatever this was, it had its own rhythm now. I placed the glass in front of him, the motion automatic, and extended my hand. "ID," I said, because that part never changed, because that part was the only thing that kept everything else from becoming something I could not control, and he handed it over without hesitation. But this time, there was something almost deliberate in the way he did it, like he was not just following the rule, he was choosing it. I glanced down, returned it, and met his gaze again, steady, grounded. "You move them back," I said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what I had observed, and for a brief moment, something almost like surprise flickered in his expression before it settled into something else, something calmer. "You notice everything," he replied, and there was no deflection in his voice, no attempt to deny it, just acknowledgement, and I shrugged slightly, wiping down the counter in a slow, even motion. "It is part of the job," I said, even though we both knew it was more than that now. He leaned back slightly, not relaxing, but adjusting, creating space in a way that felt intentional, like he was aligning himself with something he had not done before. "They make people uncomfortable," he said after a moment, his tone neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested this was not a decision he made lightly, and I glanced briefly toward where the two men stood, their presence still there, still aware, but less intrusive now, less immediate. "So do you," I replied without thinking, the words slipping out with a quiet honesty that surprised even me, and for a second, the air between us shifted, not tense, not heavy, just real, like we had stepped into a part of the conversation that could not be undone. He did not react the way most people would, did not push back, did not smile it off. He just held my gaze, steady, thoughtful, like he was measuring the truth in what I had said and finding no reason to disagree. "Does that bother you?" he asked, his voice lower now, not guarded, not distant, just direct, and I considered the question carefully, more carefully than I would have a few nights ago, because now it felt like it mattered, not just to him, but to me. "No," I said finally, my voice calm, certain, "because you do not use it on me." The words settled between us, quiet but significant, and for the first time since this began, I saw something shift in him that was not about control, not about observation, but about something deeper, something closer to trust, even if neither of us would have called it that out loud. He looked away briefly, just a second, like he needed to process something that did not fit into the structure he was used to. And when his gaze returned, there was a clarity there that had not been there before, like he had reached a conclusion he had not expected to reach this quickly. I could, he said, not as a threat, not as a warning, just as a statement of fact, and I nodded slightly, accepting that without hesitation, because I already knew it was true, because everything about him made that obvious. But you do not, I replied, holding his gaze, steady, unshaken, and something in that exchange settled into place, something quiet but undeniable, like we had both acknowledged a boundary that existed without needing to be enforced, and in that moment, I understood something that had been forming beneath the surface all along, that whatever power he carried into every room, whatever control shaped the world around him, it stopped here, not because it could not cross the line, but because he chose not to let it, and I had the unmistakable feeling that this choice, this one small, deliberate decision, was the one thing he could not take back, no matter what came next.